My name is Donal Griffin, Policy Officer at Fair Seas, and along with Regina of the Irish Wildlife Trust and Fair Seas, we'll be talking to you today about Ireland's biodiversity and what Fair Seas are doing to protect it as well. And first of all, I'd like to take a bit of time to explain what and who Fair Seas are. Fair Seas is a campaign aiming to build a movement of ocean stewardship in Ireland and Europe, and that's the very top headline aim of ours. This is actually a screen grab from our gorgeous website with the bassin sharks there, and it's a really good place to keep up to date with what we do, what we're doing, and what we're planning to do. It's www.fairseas.ie. And you can subscribe to our newsletter, and you can get access to that on our homepage or the link there if that's useful as well. Take you directly to the sign up. So Fair Seas, what are we about? We're seeking to protect, conserve, and restore Ireland's unique marine environment. That's that's our ambition, and we want to see Ireland become a world leader in marine protection. And a big part of that, marine protection and management, I would say, and a big part of that, and a big focus point of that, considering where Ireland is at the moment, is on marine protected areas. We want Ireland's healthy seas to give our species, habitats, and coastal communities the opportunity not only to survive, that's the conservation and protection aspect, but also to thrive, and that's the restoration and recovery aspect that we're keen to see as well. We're a coalition of Ireland's leading environmental non-governmental organisations, so NGOs and networks as well. And our partners, we have a fantastic range of partners: Irish Wildlife Trust, Birdwatch Ireland, Sustainable Water Network, Swan, Friends of the Irish Environment, Irish Whale Dolphin Group, the Coola Salmon Trust, the Irish Environment Network, and Coastwatch. So we're very lucky to have the support of all of those organisations as well, and hopefully we're providing the drive and thrust to work on these marine protected area issues as a consolidated campaign. And we're funded by 4 ocean conservation philanthropic organisations based out of America. And that's the Blue Nature Alliance, Oceans 5, the Beck Family Charitable Trust, and the Wise Foundation. So we work on many different things, and we're going to get into that soon, a little bit, Regina and myself, and what we've been doing, what we're planning to do, everything from outreach, engagement, policy, advocacy, campaigning, the whole lot. But I thought we would show this video. First of all, Think House Media produced this video for us back in June when it was published, and I think it sums up very well what Fair Seas is all about and what we're trying to do. And so it's a gorgeous video as well. So I'm just going to play this now, and then shortly after hand over to Regina. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
Hello Ireland, it's me, your sea. Remember that summer holiday? You were so small, you tried to jump over the waves and you squealed as I chased you back up the beach. Or that day when you cycled an hour just to sit and look out at the shore and the birds, it helped you relax. Normally I'm quite modest, but the water, plants, fish, birds, whales and sharks, they're all parts of me. I help support all kinds of life in an area 7 times bigger than our island. But we've been struggling. We've been under pressure for a long time because of things like industrial activity and pollution. In fact, 65% of our coastal habitats are not healthy at all. Now, we need your help. Healthy seas means healthy people. There's a group called Fair Seas who have this goal to bring people together to conserve and restore me and all the biodiversity I support. They want to give our species, habitats and coastal communities the opportunity to thrive. This means giving special areas, new marine protected areas, a break from damaging activity. To give us the chance to bounce back, Fair Seas wants to increase my marine protected areas from 2% to 30% by 2030. Then I can do my part. I'll store carbon, fight climate change, restore habitats and species, feed life and support livelihoods. What do you say? Love, your sea.
So hopefully you've enjoyed that short film. I think it's really brilliant film to kind of showcase what we're doing and why we're doing it. But more on what Fair Seas is doing a little bit later. I'm going to pass over to Regina now to talk about the Revitalising Our Seas report that we published back in June. So over to you, Regina.
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate to be able to have co-authored this report along with some really great colleagues of mine. And it's called Revitalising Our Seas. And within that report, we have identified areas of interest for marine protected area designation in Irish waters. And this is what the report looks like. It's available on the Fair Seas website, so fairseas.ie. You should be able to find it there. It's a couple hundred pages with annexes as well. So there's a lot of information in it, lots and lots of maps. I'm going to show you a lot of maps today as well. So we really like maps at Fair Seas. So the purpose of this report was really to kick off the discussion on MPA locations in order to accelerate designation. There's been a lot of talk around marine protected areas. The Irish government was supposed to have 10% of their seas designated as MPAs by 2020, but they failed at achieving that target. We're only at 2.1% MPA designation at the moment, and those are special areas of conservation and special protection areas that are designated under EU nature laws. And at the moment, we have no national legislation in order to designate MPAs that can be designed by the Irish government. So that's what we're lacking at the moment. And we were trying to kind of get ahead of the government in the sense that we've identified, based on best available data, where it would make the most sense to have marine protected areas, so that we can start to talk to people about the possibility of an MPA in their local area. So to take the kind of MPA conservation conversation out of the theoretical sphere and really literally put it down on paper. And it has been an amazing tool for engagement already. This is the main output of the report, and this map, we've got a big printout of this map and we've taken it to events. And it's just amazing at drawing people in just to start talking about what an MPA means, what might be allowed, what might not be allowed, and what it would generally mean for the local community. Of course, we're not going to be making any of those decisions. All we can do is advocate for best practice management at the moment, but those decisions will be up to the government in the end. But we're, as I said, we're trying to accelerate this process and kind of start the engagement early. There are 16 areas of interest in total, and they cover about 36% of Ireland's seas. So the Irish government has signed up to 30% by 2030. So we're actually a bit ahead of that target, but this is what kind of the data showed would make sense. So that's what we went with. So this talk is about marine biodiversity. So I wanted to talk a bit about that and what the kind of animals and plants and everything that we might find in Irish waters. And first of all, I want to talk about Ireland's maritime area, because we have incredible marine biodiversity here, partly because the maritime area is so huge. So these are the outlines there on the map. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but I'm pointing at it anyway. And it's about 490 square kilometers in size. It's 7 times the size of Ireland's landmass. So it's really a massive area. And this is what the Irish government has committed to protecting 30% of. So 30% of that is a really, really big area as well. And the next map is going to show you the depth ranges. So again, part of the reason why we have so much marine biodiversity in Ireland is because the Irish maritime area really covers shallow areas, so maybe 50 meters around the coast, and then go into 200 meters, this large area all around Ireland is relatively shallow, and then it drops really steeply down to 2,000 to 3,000 meters in this area, and even 5,000 meters over here. So really, really diverse depth ranges. And I've given 2 examples here for why that matters. So we have the Portuguese dogfish here, which is a shark, a deep sea shark. And in the report, we mapped the locations, the distribution, occurrences of the most threatened shark species. And a lot of them are deep sea sharks just because they are so slow growing and they are vulnerable to bycatch in deep water fisheries. And their distribution is generally around where the really deep waters are, along this slope. So where the continental shelf stops and drops off into the deep sea, that's where these species like to live. And that compared to, for example, the taupe shark, which doesn't look too different to the deep sea shark, but it actually likes to hang around more shallow areas. So the Irish Sea is really important for the taupe shark, for example. And that variation is really important when it comes to MPA designation, because we need to make sure that we protect a little bit of everything. So we can't just say, we'll designate the deep sea and that's the job done, that's our 30%, because we wouldn't have covered any of the taupe shark's habitat within those MPAs. So we need to really make sure that we have a varied MPA design, MPA network that covers a bit of all of these species. And besides the depth, I also want to briefly touch on the importance of seabed habitat types. So we have different types of seabed sediment, I suppose. And this map shows that. It's a bit crazy looking, but essentially each habitat has a different color. And we can see, for example, the yellow is deep circulatory mud. So all of the yellow would be a muddy habitat. Then the pink is, I believe, sand, whereas the blue would be gravel. So there's quite a lot of variation in the seabed sediment, and then that coupled with depth kind of then really matters when it comes to the type of biodiversity you might find in these areas. So it's really important, again, you cover a wide variety of these kind of habitat types in your MPA design. And I want to just zoom in a little bit because there's a lot going on around the Irish coast, huge variability in the Irish Sea alone. I mentioned earlier, these yellow areas are the muddy sediments, and the kind of species that you might find in that would be this Norway lobster, Nephrops norvegicus, and they like to form burrows in the mud. There are one of the most important fisheries in Ireland is for this Dublin Bay prawn, as they're sometimes called. On top of mud like that, you might find sea pens, such as these really fragile animals. They're related to, for example, anemones. Again, really interesting kind of habitat. You wouldn't think that of mud. You'd think mud is quite barren, but actually that's not true at all. It can be full of life. In the more shallow areas, you might find something like a seagrass bed. So this again is it's a marine flowering plant that colonizes muddy or sandy environments in shallow regions. So it needs light because the plant needs light to grow. So this sort of thing you might find in a shallow inshore bay. So huge variability just in sedimentary areas alone. When you're looking at more rocky areas like the south coast, this light blue color is a rocky habitat. In the shallow regions, you might find kelp forests. So kelp again needs light to grow. It's an algae. So that the shallow sheltered rocks near the coast would be often dominated by kelp forests. In the more exposed coast, so you might be somewhere where there's a lot of wave action, you might be more used to seeing lots of barnacles on the rocks, or you might see some mussels. Again, completely different habitat, but completely reliant on a hard surface to attach to. So rocks can be quite amazing for a reef to form. In deeper areas, you might also find where there's no kelp able to grow. You might also find habitat that's more dominated by anemones or corals or sponges. Again, huge diversity just on rocks in the marine. So really, really amazing, the kind of diversity we have. And in our report, we included seabed species. We picked some of the most threatened types of species that we thought were really important to include in the MPA network, and that includes seagrass and marl beds, which is a coralline algae, kelp forests, and oyster beds as well. So oysters used to grow all along the east coast in the Irish Sea, but they have been completely fished out. So they're no longer there. There are a few remnants left on the west coast. The bays like Tralee Bay or Galway Bay still have some native oyster beds remaining. But Donal mentioned earlier the importance of restoration. We're now at a point where we can't simply just protect or conserve what we have. We have to restore. And that's where something like oysters will come in. If we're planning an NPA network that includes parts of the Irish Sea where we used to have oysters, it's very important to then also look at restoration to try and get back some of the biodiversity that we had a couple of hundred years ago, rather than just trying to conserve what we have now. I think that's one of the main messages as well to take away from today. So I've talked a lot about the seabed, and parts of the reason why the seabed is so important is because lots of the larger mobile species that maybe most people know, such as cod in this case, they rely on a healthy seabed. Here we have cod swimming in a kelp forest, and cod rely on kelp and seagrass for several stages of their life cycle, especially when they're juveniles. They need this three-dimensional habitat to shelter in, and kelp is a great example of that. So hugely important habitat for these kind of species. Here we have an angel shark swimming over a seagrass bed. Angel sharks are critically endangered now. Populations have declined by, I think, 95%. And areas like Tralee Bay is one of the last remaining hotspots. So hugely important that we protect these areas as soon as possible. Angel sharks are very threatened by fisheries, especially tangle net fishery for crayfish, which is happening around Tralee, and essentially any animal that we lose at this point is really threatening to the population because they are so endangered. So what else did we cover in the report? We looked at cetaceans. There are 25 species of cetaceans in Irish waters, and we mapped their distribution and density, and that helped us identify where an NPA might make sense. I'm going to give you a couple of examples later on. We looked at elasmobranchs, which are sharks, rays, skates, and chimeras. There are 71 species of elasmobranchs in Irish waters, and we looked at the ones that are most threatened, such as the angel shark I mentioned earlier, and where is their distribution. And again, I'll show you a couple of maps later on. And then we also looked at seabirds. So there are 38 species of seabirds in Irish waters. And we mapped their colonies and their general distribution around the Irish maritime area, as well as their kind of migration bottlenecks and things like that. There's a lot of that kind of detail in the report if you're interested in reading that. And then I'll give you a couple of examples before handing back over to Donal then. So this is our northwest continental shelf area of interest, and it includes the seamount, which you can see up at the north border to Scotland. So that's Ireland's only seamount. Seamounts are actually listed under the OSPAR conventions, threatened and declining habitats. There's a big seamount here. You can see what they kind of look like. And most of the seamount is in Scottish waters, but some of that is in Ireland. And this is actually a marine protected area on the Scottish side. But of course, the seamount is one ecosystem. The fish don't care about the border. So it would make a lot of sense to also protect the Irish side here and the deep sea that surrounds it. So that was one of the reasons why we chose this site. Then, of course, we have this continental slope, which I already mentioned is extremely important for deep sea sharks, as well as corals and sponge reefs that grow along here. Some of the most diverse coral reefs are in these kind of canyons that you can see running down the slope. And then deep diving whales. So here is a map of the density of, in this case, a sperm whale. And the kind of darker squares show higher density of whales. And the Cuvier's-beaked whales that use this area as well, deep diving species, you can see the picture here, and they hunt squid in the deep sea. So another reason why we also chose to include some of the deep sea area here, and this being the largest area of interest for all of these reasons. Then the loop head to Kenmare area of interest. So just wanted to give up one example of an inshore site, and to me this is one of the most incredible ones for so many reasons. So Tralee Bay, as I mentioned already, one of the last remaining hotspots for critically endangered elasmobranchs, including the angel shark. Around Dingo and the Blasket Islands, there were very high density of basking shark. Of course, basking shark is now the first marine fish to be listed under the Wildlife Act. Really, really amazing news since last Monday. So this is very fresh and exciting. Hopefully that's a precedent for including other sharks as well. So really, really great news. Here's a map of the seabird colonies in the area. And that is actually one of the reasons why these areas are so large that we chose. So you can see all of the inshore areas are quite large. And that's because these important seabird colonies and seabirds foraging for fish, flying quite large, quite wide distances away from their colony to forage for fish. And it's just really important that they are protected in all of that foraging area, so that they can be catching their fish in peace and not die as bycatch in the meantime. And also for the fish populations that they rely on to be in a good state within the entire Irish Maritime area, really. The Blaskets here, you can see they are home to 60% of the entire population of storm petrel. I believe it's the most important colony in the world for that species. And also 60% of the entire Irish population of Manx shearwater breed on the Blaskets. We have the Skelligs in this area, which have 74% of the entire Irish population of gannets. I believe the second largest gannet colony in the world. So incredibly important. Puffin Island, very important for puffin with 26% of the population. So that's an incredible area for seabirds around here. And then the cetaceans as well. So minke whale sightings, very dense around the Blaskets, and the same for humpback whales outside Dingle Bay, very high density, and around the Blaskets as well. So that was those were the reasons for choosing this site here. And in the report, you can go through each one of these areas in detail, and it'll show you all of these maps as well. So I hope you go away and have a look at that, because I won't have time to go through each of them, unfortunately, here today. So then I just wanted to leave you with a picture of the current marine protected areas we have in Ireland. So these are the existing special areas of conservation and special protection areas. All of these offshore sites are special areas of conservation that are designated for reef habitat. But unfortunately, a lot of the sites just don't have any management associated with them. So it's really sad to see areas like seagrass beds declining, even though they're in a protected area, and a lot of examples like that. And then that compared to, of course, the UK, which has over 30% of their waters already designated as marine protected areas. Not that they're necessarily better managed than the Irish sites, but at least they're trying, you know. So just the comparison is incredible, I think. So we're really hoping that the Irish government will, as soon as possible, act on their promises to protect 30%. And with that, I'll hand you back over to Donal.
Thanks, Regina, for that. And that's given us a real good insight into some of the amazing marine biodiversity we have in Ireland. And I just wanted to spend the next 5 or 6 minutes talking about what Fair Seas is doing. Well, what is Fair Seas doing, but what is Fair Seas doing to protect all this marine biodiversity that we have? And what is going on at government level too? I guess that includes that as well. So in terms of what Fair Seas are doing, it's been a busy year for the campaign, and considering, you know, we're just over a year old, we're still a relatively young campaign, but we have been busy. And this is a screen grab from our website, and it showcases the articles, blogs, press releases which Fair Seas have published over the past year. But it really showcases the diverse range of issues which are live right now, and which have the possibility and the potential to impact on healthy seas or marine protected areas. Everything from basking shark protection that Regina mentioned there, to offshore wind issues, to different EU laws that are coming online that will impact on Ireland and what they need or have to do at sea, the Sustainable Development Goals. And coming back to what Karen mentioned at the start about the Citizen Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, which I'll get into in more detail soon. We had the Revitalising Our Seas report, which Regina just gave a really good summary of. Fantastic resource for Fair Seas going forward as well. We have been engaging with political reps. This is Fair Seas team and the AEN team at the recent Fianna Fáil Ardèche, and we'll be attending others over the coming months. But we've been working with lots of different elected representatives to make sure our seas and marine protected areas and everything that goes along with that is well on their radar and high on, and remain, or begins to be high or remains high, whatever your view is, on the government's agenda. And that's really important to make sure, we get the good outcomes that we want. We're also engaging with the fishing industry in different ways. When we've produced a series of videos with fishermen around Ireland, and it's a fantastic series. It's called Real Voices. I'd encourage anyone to have a look, and it's just very frank conversations with different fishermen, asking them their views on marine protected areas and marine management from their experience, excuse me, on the ground. So really interesting type way of engaging with that industry as well. And we're also engaging with local communities. Fair Seas attended a community event just last weekend in Waterville in County Kerry. We've given presentations like this at various local community events online and in person. And we're involved with a group of students, marketing students at the University of Limerick as well. So, we're doing lots, and we're hoping to do a lot more over the next year as well. And just to come to the Ireland Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, Fair Seas submitted a response to their, ask for their request for submissions recently. But first of all, the Ireland Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. So it's a group of 99 people, Irish citizens, which are representative of Ireland's society. And that in this assembly, they're informed about the biodiversity emergency or crisis that we're in at the moment, about biodiversity loss in Ireland, and tasked with making recommendations to the Irish government after considering all the evidence that will help tackle it. And their first meeting was in May, and it's due to conclude and make the recommendations to the government at the end of this year. And I just want to take you through a little bit of what we included in our response. Fair Seas believes a whole of society, whole of government approach is needed that drives change in attitudes and behaviours at an individual level, so each one of us, but also a societal level. From that right through to effective government action on biodiversity loss, and effective international collaboration, which is becoming more and more important on species and habitat conservation as well. And at a national level, again, the Irish government, we feel, must treat the decline and loss of Ireland's biodiversity as the crisis and emergency that it is. And that's both at sea and on land as well. And they must follow through and properly implement various existing agreements and policies which have been designed to protect nature. We have new MPA legislation coming down the line, but we also have lots of current legislation that has been designed to protect nature that we need to realise the benefits of. And that's everything from the Marine Strategy Framework Directive and delivering good environmental status, to the Common Fisheries Policy, to end overfishing, the EU Birds and Habitats Directive, the Marine Spatial Planning. There's a whole host of different legislation there that need to start to deliver for nature and our seas. And when talking about biodiversity loss, it's always important, and Regina touched on some of these issues about, it's important to put the context of, we have such an amazing biodiversity here in Ireland, in our seas, but that's only a proportion of what was there before. It has declined over the years, and we need to think about why that has happened. And in the Irish government's own assessment, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, in the 2020 assessment, they concluded that the most significant man-made pressure on biological diversity in Ireland's maritime area is unsustainable and high-impact fishing, and saying that the extraction of fish and shellfish, both commercial and non-commercial species and associated disturbance introduced by human fishing activity is a primary reason that has driven biodiversity loss. And also that for larger marine vertebrate species, for example, marine mammals, fish, seabirds, sea turtles, the introduction of anthropogenic man-made sound, the disturbance of species, the input of litter or pollution are all considered to present the greatest secondary pressures. And it also added that climate change resulting from human economic practices, development and other activities is also a significant driver with the potential to impact negatively on the marine environment. So, I mean, we know what the pressures are, and it's just on about now about implementing existing law and policy and legislation, like I just mentioned, that would go some way and go a long way in tackling these issues, but also that we have new legislation that's fit for purpose as well. And a big one for us, of course, is the MPA legislation, which I'll talk about in a minute. So in our submission to the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss, we made 13 different recommendations that we feel the Assembly should consider and should consider recommending themselves to government. And I'm not going to go through them all. This is all on our website under the news section, and you can read our full submission and all our recommendations, but I'm going to highlight a couple here. And the first one, number one, as you'd expect, designate and manage at least 30% of Irish waters as a marine protected area. And that's, I think, Regina had touched on this as well. It's the program it's in the program for the current program for government to do that. You know, we just want to make sure that the government does do that and does it in the right way with the proper management and enforcement and everything else that comes after that, not just the designation. It's really important. So that's inside marine protected areas. But number two here, we want to implement ambitious marine conservation measures to ensure good environmental status of Ireland seas. So that's relating to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, because even if we have 30% of marine protected areas, and let's say even, for example, that they're all in fantastic condition and status and doing what we want them to do, that still leaves 70% of our seas that we still need to be using sustainably, and we still need to be in healthy condition. You know, so 1 and 2 there, the way I think about it is 1 is inside MPAs and 2 is outside MPAs, how we achieve healthy and resilient seas. And number 3 there, we need to invest in restoration programs, and Regina again touched on it perfectly. We need to recover our most vulnerable and biodiverse coastal habitats and endangered species. And for some, like oysters, like seagrass, like salt marsh, other biogenic reefs, they've been degraded to such a point that relieving the pressure on them isn't enough anymore, that we need to actually step in and assist their recovery. And that's what number 3 is getting at there. And I'll just also highlight number 5, with implementing an ambitious and effective national biodiversity action plan and to jumpstart nature's recovery in Ireland. And actually, there's an open consultation on that at the moment now. Fair Seas will be responding it and making sure that the marine and marine issues are well represented in that action plan. And as I said, we have 13 in total, and I just want to highlight 2 more, and they're connected. Number 11 is nature, biodiversity, and the natural environment topics are taught as part of the mainstream national and secondary school curricula in Ireland. I think it's so important that we teach these issues and about marine biodiversity from a really young age and right through, you know, all our education years. I think it's so important because it's only when we know about things, you know, that we can start to see them in our own lives and start to notice them. And it's only by noticing nature, biodiversity, that we begin to care about it. And it's only when we care about these things that we will take action to protect it, or indeed encourage others, i.e. elected representatives, to take action to protect them. And number 12 is greater involvement of Ireland's youth in policy and legislative decision-making across government, not solely confined to matters of the environment either. I think that's so important. I think more and more youth voices are being heard these days, in Ireland probably, and around the world, and that's fantastic, probably more so than ever before. But also, I'm not convinced that all those voices are being listened to. I think there's a difference in being heard but being listened to. And I think the involvement of youth in policy and legislation decision making should become a normal, routine part of everyday governmental processes rather than being this one-off where we call them in, get their views and ship them out again. So I think that's really important. But as Karen said, again, you can submit your own views before the end of November, but we've heard from the Assembly itself to the Citizen Assembly on biodiversity loss to have the greatest impact. Submit your views before the 16th of October, so only a few days away. And there's lots of information on the IEN website about how to do that, and you can also look at the citizensassembly.ie website for more information on that as well. So that leaves the last couple of slides here now is just about what's next for Fair Seas and what next for our marine biodiversity here in Ireland. And the big focus for us now, and until it's over the line, is the new marine protected area legislation. We think it's due next year, and that will be a huge focus for us, and making sure that it delivers what we wanted to deliver, and it does what we wanted to do. But after that, and so let's say, imagine for a minute that we get it through next year, and it's exactly what we wanted. You know, the real work begins then. In terms of achieving and establishing the network, expanding Ireland's network from 2.1% to 30% in 8 or so years. You know, the government will have to at that stage think about the process of engaging and consulting with local communities, presenting the evidence, debating the boundaries of where these sites may go, how they'll be managed, who will manage them, the governance, the logistics, the enforcement, the pragmatics, you know, all these things. It's a huge amount of work that has to be done. And it's all yet to be done, you know, once we get this legislation through. So, and it's not our job to do any of that, by the way, it's the government's, but it is our job to make sure the government do it right. And it's Fair Seas' role. And we've got the mandate from our partners to be a voice for Ireland Seas in that process. So that will be a big part of what we do over the coming years. And then there's just very quickly, there's the other legislation and policy drivers which impact on marine biodiversity and impact on the MPA process as well, which Fair Seas, you know, has to be across the detail of and make sure are progressing in the right way. Everything from the Citizens Assembly we just talked about to the MSFD, the National Biodiversity Action Plan, the Offshore Renewable Energy Development Plan, the Common Fisheries Policy. I mean, the list goes on and on, actually. So there's a huge amount of work still to be done. And the last thing I'll mention, which is very high on the Fair Seas to-do list, we are organising a marine conference on World Oceans Day on the June 8th, 2023, next year in Cork, Cork City Hall. And the aim of that conference is to bring together all the marine decision makers and stakeholders across Ireland into one room to begin the conversations of kind of everything we've just been talking about, and many of these issues at least, in an open and transparent way, and to bring people also from further afield internationally and from other places to learn from their experiences, from, you know, about what to do, how to do it, and maybe also what not to do. And really to inject the urgency into marine protection, MPA, looking after our seas, to inject urgency into all of that here in Ireland, which I think is badly needed. So if you're interested, please save the date. It's June 8th next year. And again, you can keep up to date on that at www.fairseas.ie or subscribe to our newsletter as well on our homepage. So that's all from us. Made it around a few minutes over, actually, so sorry about that. But thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Donal and Regina. You've given us so much to think about. I know just listen, and I saw JB Rahu put in the comments as well that, you know, it was very comprehensive and that he didn't know any of this before. And certainly I agree. I didn't even know what seagrass was several months ago, and now I am an ardent defender of seagrass in every way, shape and form. So what I'd like to do is turn it over now to the floor. Are there any comments, questions? There was a comment in the chat about how do we reconcile the need to develop our wind power and marine protected areas. So I know Aoife O'Mahony put in a response from the Fair Seas that Fair Seas recognises the importance of marine renewable energy generation to help Ireland reduce its emissions and combat climate change, but as with all developments at sea, they must always be planned and designed to, at all times, avoid, reduce and mitigate their impacts on habitats and species. Donal or Regina, would you like to comment further on that?
I'll not say much because I think that says perfectly what Eve has put into the chat there, but what I will say is we absolutely need clean, green, renewable energy, and a big part of the renewable mix I see in the future is is going to be offshore wind. I think we're probably talking about most of all, but we can't tackle, and that's good for tackling the climate crisis, as Eva said, reducing our emissions, which is fantastic, but we can't tackle the climate change emergency at the expense and simultaneously making the biodiversity crisis worse. And that's why we need to have the right technology in the right place and have just all the proper environmental checks and balances that we can to ensure that those developments are done in the right way and sited in the right places. And it's all about doing it in the right way. It's not about not doing it at all.
Thanks for that, Donal. Regina, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that's perfect there. I was actually watching Padraig Fogarty's webinar yesterday, and he touched on these multiple crises that we're in, and he also highlighted that it's really important to tackle them together. It's actually not multiple crises, it's one crisis of overconsumption of resources, and we just have to tackle all that together.
Could I ask, could wind farms be in protected areas?
In
other words, you build the wind farm and then once it's built, there's no disturbance or anything else, and that area has an additional protection maybe.
Yeah, and that's a fair argument as well. I think it's and it's something we're going back and forth on now, even within Fair Seas, because there are aspects of that additional protection that you mentioned from having a wind farm in an area. But of course, by virtue of having the wind farm and the turbines there are lots of disturbances and negative impacts, from that construction and from that loss of habitat to this of seabed by having these 20-meter wide foundational structures, maybe thousands of them. It's a considerable loss of seabed habitat, and it's also the disruption and the cabling that has to make its way onshore, and through our coastal habitats, which are mostly and usually our most diverse habitats. So it can be argued both ways. I'm not Fair Seas. I'm not sure we're all the way there, but I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier about as long as no matter if they're MPAs or not, I suppose what I'm saying, that they need to be done in the right way and situated in the right place. And all the environmental checks and balances need to be accounted for. And I think that's what it comes down to, making sure that the process of planning and site selection and all the rest is as environmentally mindful as possible.
Thanks, Donal. So there's a few, thank you for your question as well, Ethel. There's a few more questions coming in on the chat here, thick and fast, about renewables. Do we know well enough how to develop renewables offshore, and can they help regenerate any ecosystems, is one question. And Jamie Rohu, just on sort of on the same topic, but just an add-on on renewables, could floating turbines be used instead?
Well, Gina, jump in here anytime, but I'll have another go at this. In terms of, offshore, there are wind farms all around the world, and our nearest neighbours are the UK, and they have over 2,000 wind turbines in their seas, and most of them located in the North Sea, and they're planning many more thousands over the next 10 years and further beyond. So the technology's there. There's nothing exceptional about Ireland in the sense that it's any different really. We have shallower waters where fixed turbine are, suitable. We have also, as Regina, we know from the maps Regina presented earlier, we have really deep waters where, floating, fixed turbine doesn't make sense, and where floating might be an option as well. But the fixed turbine versus floating, the development of floating technology is a bit behind the fixed turbine stuff. There's still some questions there about the impacts it may have. It's floating, it doesn't have the turbine attached to the seafloor, but it has these huge anchors that anchor it to the floor. So there's issues there that we're not quite sure of yet. But again, and I'm at the risk of repeating myself here, but it comes back to when those proposals are developed or put forward, that the proper research and the right information is found, and it's used and is presented, and that all the impacts and the arguments for and against that Ethel mentioned are all included in that mix of information by the people who are making the planning decisions. And that's all that we can ask for, really. We would also, one other thing we would ask for is that marine protected areas, the current suite of marine protected areas that we have, and also the suite of marine protected areas that we will have in the future, also get fair mention and mindful in those decisions as well, because the offshore wind is progressing at a rate in Ireland, for good reasons, because we need that energy, as we said. But the MPAs is lagging a bit behind in terms of how fast we're getting there with realizing our MPA ambitions. So as long as they're not forgotten about or put to one side, and that those two processes can be progressed together, would be ideal.
Thanks, Donal. Regina, would you like to come in and add anything, or are you okay?
No, I think Donal said it all there, and it's important to keep in mind we're not wind farm experts, and wind farms are kind of a new pressure. We mightn't even see any being built anytime soon. We have the Arklow Bank, which is a very small wind farm site, but other than that, there's actually no wind farms in Ireland yet. It's important to keep in mind that fisheries is the main pressure, and Donal said that really well as well. So the industrial scale fishing, and somebody put into the chat here about the trawling ban inside 6 nautical mile zone, and all of the species that we talked about in the report, the birds, the cetaceans, the sharks, they rely on healthy fish populations to live, to feed their young, etc. And this 6 nautical mile trawling ban, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but it would have stopped at least pair trawling for sprat, and sprat is a very important forage fish inside the 6 nautical mile zone, and that was really, really unfortunately overturned. And that's one of the most important actions that could have been taken over the past couple of years, would have been to bring in that trawling ban. And I believe it's still in the courts. We really don't know what's happening there, but that would be such an important thing to do for our species inshore.
Thanks, Regina. I was just about to turn to fisheries, so you really you turned the conversation really nicely there, because there was a question in the chat about a provision for the protection of sprat, which is being overfished to over 5 times the recommendation as we speak. So that's one element which I think you touched on in terms of the nautical mile ban. But then there's another question here, which is an interesting one to consider. And how do you control and monitor fishing activities, especially those large commercial vessels, to ensure sea life and seabed are protected? There are also a couple of interesting comments about additional risks of wind turbines, and that is, risks to seabirds and the cabling risks to seabeds. And those are certainly all big considerations when planning comes into play. So over to you, Regina and Donal, on sprat, and then how do we monitor and enforce commercial fisheries?
I can start on that. So yeah, there's no quota for sprat, which is a huge issue. There should be a quota, of course. Every single species in our seas should be managed sustainably. Currently, it's not managed at all. And for such an important forage species, it's really not a good not a good thing. The management, so the monitoring of large vessels, is actually not that difficult because they have vessel monitoring devices on board. So the likes of the Sea Fisheries Protection Authority would know where the vessels are at all times, as does the Navy. The main issue there is probably that the Navy is not really capable of doing proper enforcement, because I think they have maybe 2 vessels or something to cover that vast area of offshore that I showed you on the map earlier. But generally, from our point of view as well, there are websites like the Global Fishing Watch website where you can always see almost in real time where vessels are and whether or not they're engaging in fishing activity. There's an algorithm they use based on the vessel speed. You can tell whether or not they're likely to be fishing, and you can use that data to analyze. You can download it and analyze the spatial footprint of different fishing activities. And nowadays with satellite data and everything, it's really progressed quite a lot in recent years. And I think MPA management from the large fishing fleet is probably easy enough if you have the resources and the staff. Donal, do you have something to add to that?
I thought that was great, and I'll just add that you've kind of touched on it as well, that the fishing industry is not a monolith in Ireland or anywhere in the world. That you have what Regina said, these huge big trawlers, sometimes, a lot of the time, maybe coming from other countries, other parts of the world, and then you have like local fishing on a much smaller scale, in sustainable ways, using different, more sustainable gears, all this sorts of things. So it's we do say fishing, and we use it as a catch-all term, but in reality, the impacts and the sustainability varies depending on what boat you're using, what gear you're using, where you're based, where you're fishing, how you're fishing, when you're fishing. I mean, it's such a complicated picture. But I mean, and Regina again touched on it. It's about for the quota species is remaining within scientific advice levels, and it's about fishing sustainably, everything. I think Regina said, and I would totally agree with that. But also just on the control and monitoring and everything else. It's just I have experience from the UK and something that they're trialing in earnest over there, and different pilot projects and rollout stages is remote electronic monitoring. So not just the positional information of boats, trying to approximate from that when and for how long boats fish, but also actually monitoring the catch using cameras and using AI software and all this. So that's, there are parts in the world where that's been rolled out, and it's very, there are some successes and there are some not successes, and there are people for it and there are people against it, as you suspect. But that's a fully documented fisheries are a real important aspect of sustainable fisheries. So it's something to think about. But Ireland, I don't believe are at that stage yet, but it could be on the cards.
And just about that as well, I suppose if you have a marine protected area that allows some fishing but not other fishing, or allows fishing for some species but not others, it's a lot harder to monitor that. Whereas if you say there can be no fishing in this area, it's a lot easier then to see there's a fishing vessel in there, they're breaking the law. It's much easier for the people monitoring if you have those kind of stricter protected areas where there should be no fishing going on at all, versus don't do that, but this is okay. It's much harder to see from a remote place whether or not they're within the law.
Thanks, Regina and Donal. There's a few more comments coming in the chat and questions. One from Owen Clarkin: the important thing is to carry out proper strategic environmental assessment and select correct sites. I think everyone would agree with that. And another question, now I think this is outside FAIRC's remit or scope, but I'd be interested if anyone would have any tips or comments here, and I'm sure other people would. Can you recommend what key criteria to identify for consumers in the consumption of fish and seafood? If people are attempting to eat fish more sustainably, how do they make those decisions, and are there any resources available for that? Because it can be quite confusing for consumers about how much fish and shellfish to eat and which types are the most sustainable. Any comments on that? And if FAIRC doesn't have any comments, or Donal, Regina, then that's absolutely fine. I know it's definitely not one of the campaign platforms.
Yeah, so the Marine Conservation Society, which is a UK NGO, have a really good, it's called a Good Fish Guide, and you can download it as an app, and it's brilliant. You search the species when you're in the shop, you look up the species, and it'll tell you exactly which one to choose, which not to choose. So you might have a species that can be both caught by trawls, and that can also be caught by long lines. It tells you which method to choose and which it's not. It also tells you about the stock, whether that stock is overfished or not. So it's a lot of information in there. You can Google that, Good Fish Guide. It's brilliant.
Thanks a million, Regina. So we're over time now. I think we'll just take a couple more questions from everyone. So one of the questions is, are the results of the coastal surveys over the last 5 years incorporated into the MPA recommendations? And another question is, which countries have already installed wind turbines in large numbers? What has been the impact on biodiversity? And really, are there lessons to be learned from these and any success stories? So if we could maybe take those together.
Yeah, I'll go and I'll take the second question first there. And as I mentioned earlier, UK is pretty, along with parts of America and some Asian countries as well, probably UK as a leader, a world leader in the rollout, along with the Danes actually, in offshore wind. And there are, I mean, the success story is that they have a huge amount of offshore wind renewable energy compared to almost as per capita, per population, it's huge. So that is a win, but there has been impacts on biodiversity there. There are some MPAs which are in unfavorable condition because of cabling. There are many groups over in the UK that would suggest that seabird population numbers aren't helped by the huge expanses of offshore wind in the North Sea. So there are impacts there. I mean, there's the loss of habitat that I mentioned before, like probably well over 2,000 turbines now fixed to the seafloor. Normally in these sandy, muddy habitats that Regina was saying earlier, you think would be barren, but are actually full of life. But they are turned to a different sort of habitat. There's a hard infrastructure presented there. Stuff starts to settle there, starts to grow a new community of diversity. That can be, that's arguably a pro biodiversity thing to happen, but also, it is a change of what was there before. So there are success stories as well in some of the ways that they have tried to mitigate the impact of those wind farms, in terms of how they cover over cables that bring the electricity on shore, of how the structure and design of the turbines themselves to make them more reef forming friendly. There's all these sorts of things, but and those are all the same sorts of issues that we will inevitably be discussing soon when the rollout of marine turbines in Irish waters will be really scaled up. And I can't remember the first question now, yes.
The first question is about coastal surveys and how they've played an impact on the designation of MPAs. But that might be a more detailed question to get into with only 2 minutes left. So what we might do is grab some email details, and then we could have a more detailed discussion, because I think that that's probably a little bit complex.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, Karen.
Great. Okay, thanks a million. So the very final, so I think that question was from, sorry, I'm scrolling up. But if we could get the email details, please, and then we'll come back to you following today. So the one last question that I have is, how do we reconcile fish farming with sustainable fisheries? And is there any reconciliation to be made there? Thanks.
Regina, do you want to take this one? I'm not going to say much on this at all, other than, you know, fish farming is completely different to wild caught fishing activities, but they both need to be sustainable in every aspect of the processes of which happen in them. And there are issues in fish farming to do with, you know, we're mostly talking about salmon here, I think, in this part of the world and in Scotland, and there's issues to do with parasites, sea lice, with chemical use deposited on the seabed, you know, the huge amount of feces and particulate that gathers on the seabed, the changing of how, you know, kind of the hydromorphology of bays in which these are in terms of salmon escaping from sea pens, and then can have a really detrimental genetic impact on wild populations of salmon. You know, those are all huge issues which the industry is tackling, I guess. But I think it's important to say as well that fish farming around the world provides a huge amount of food. That is a huge aspect to do with food security. So it's nothing against fish farming on my side of things, but you know, we really need to address head on the impacts that they have, I would say.
So I think that was, Regina, do you have any kind of final comments on that particular question or anything else?
I was going to add the impact of catching wild fish to feed the salmon as well. So it's not really aquaculture versus wild caught. It's you have to catch fish to feed the salmon. So it is having an impact on the wild populations of kind of smaller forage fish, going back to sprat again. And also in Ireland, most salmon farming is organic, so they don't actually use any chemicals, but they do use cleaner fish like wrasse in order to clean the sea lice off the fish in the salmon cages. And then there's an overfishing issue of wrasse, possibly. We don't know because that fishery isn't being regulated at all. So yeah, a lot of issues around fish farming, unfortunately, in Ireland.
That's great. Thanks a million, Regina. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up at the moment. We've gone over everyone's lunch times. So what I did want to ask everyone to do is please consider making a submission to the Citizens Assembly. We've put a link in the chat to lots of resources that the IEN has, and sample our own actually submission from the Environmental Pillar, our advocacy arm. You know, they want to hear from us on what nature means to us and what we think should be done to protect it. So please do make your voices heard. Also, we hope to see you next week as we welcome Nuala Madigan to talk about bogs and biodiversity. So thanks again to everyone who took the time this afternoon to join us. Thank you to Donal and Regina, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you very much, everyone.
See you, folks.